George Dickle Tennessee Whiskey was founded in 1870 by George and Augusta Dickel. George believed that where your whiskey is from matters. He went out of his way to source the most special place he could find, and that is what brought him here to Cascade Hollow. The original distillery was lost to Prohibition, but it was rebuilt in the late 1950s using the exact same water source, Cascade Spring. Today, 100% of George Dickle Tennessee Whiskey is made here in this distillery by our team of dedicated experts. One of the incredible privileges here at Cascade Hollow is that we have a real wealth of mature aging whiskeys. It's just so rare in American whiskey to find a distillery that still has so much aging stock. This was one of the things that most excited me about taking this role, the ability to work with so many incredible and unique whiskeys. I agree with George that where your whiskey is from matters, and that's part of why the whiskey from Cascade Hollow is so special. We have Cascade Spring, of course, our own water source. We've got all the native yeasts that are present here in this facility, the equipment that's been here since the late 50s or the 70s. There's just so many aspects of this distillery that really can't be duplicated anywhere else. I'm Nicole Austin. I'm the general manager and distiller of Cascade Hollow Distilling Co., which is the home of George Dickle Tennessee Whiskey. People ask me all the time, how did I get this job? And I fully admit it wasn't exactly a planned outcome. I started my career in chemical engineering on the environmental side, which really kind of felt most interesting to me. It turned out that's mainly a euphemism for wastewater treatment, which was not exactly the most inspiring field to be a part of. I learned a lot and I really enjoyed it, but I knew pretty early on that that wasn't what I wanted to do with my whole career. So I was looking around trying to find inspiration, and I found it at an amazing bourbon bar in Brooklyn when I was poured a particularly special whiskey, and they talked about how it was distilled, and I just had a real light bulb moment that I could do that. You know, that's what I could use my skills to create. At that time, this was like 2008, 2009, the craft spirits industry was only just barely getting going. And I really learned pretty quickly I didn't have the right last name to work in Kentucky, and I didn't have the right degree for Scotland. So I was getting a bit frustrated, and out of pure luck, that was the year that Kings County became the first licensed distillery to produce in New York City since Prohibition. So I knocked on their door, and they let me in, and that was really my toehold in the industry. After that, I started consulting with a man named Dave Pickerel, and he was often called the Johnny Appleseed of craft distilling, and he taught me a lot. We helped open dozens of distilleries around the U.S. while I was still working at Kings County. He really made me a better distiller. And that's part of what helped me get the job offer to go to Tullamore for 2 years to be the commissioning engineer for Tullamore Dew. So it was a real Goldilocks story for me, from very, very small distilleries to a massive distillery in Ireland, which when I got the call about this job to be the general manager and distiller for Cascade Hollow, it really felt just right. So I'm so proud and excited to be able to share these whiskeys with you. Let's go taste. So, as you probably know, if you read the label, Dickel is Tennessee whiskey. And what is Tennessee whiskey, right? There's so many misconceptions out there about it. So, Tennessee whiskey is bourbon. It's a regional identity of bourbon. And the way it's different is, so bourbon has to be made in the United States, it has to be made from corn, distilled to a low proof, aged in new casks, less than 125. So Tennessee whiskey follows all those rules, but it has two extra. So to be a Tennessee whiskey, you have to be in the state of Tennessee, which feels really reasonable. And then you also have to use the Lincoln County process, which is a traditional charcoal mellowing process, We've been following those traditions here on site at Cascade Hollow for more than 150 years, so it's something that we've really integrated into our process. The filtration is really interesting, right? It kind of sits in balance with the distillation. So making Tennessee whiskey is a little bit different than making a traditional bourbon. It uses less distillation to do the separation and relies more on this charcoal mellowing process to separate the unwanted congeners, things that are heavy, oily, sulfury, away from the ones that we want to keep, like these beautiful rich grain flavors and fruity notes. So it's a little bit of a different approach, and I think it builds a lot of complexity, and you'll really see that when you taste through our whiskeys. So first I want to taste Dickle 12 with you, which is our flagship, and it's the whiskey that I drink most commonly. So common misconception about Dickle 12, a lot of people think it's an age statement. It's actually a recipe number, and what it's referring to is the blend recipe, so all the different whiskeys that we pull out of the warehouse to make Dickle 12. It's the most complex of all of our whiskeys, and I think when you nose it, you can really see that. It's big, bold whiskey, real whiskey drinkers whiskey. The waxy fruit character, I think, is what presents first. It's that Dickel house style that we talked about that's generated from the charcoal mellowing. Also a lot of vanilla, kind of a spice character, and the wood underneath gives it a lot of structure. I think those so many layers of flavors is one of the things that makes this whiskey so great for cocktailing, especially heavy dilution cocktails. And I think we've got Brian here today who's going to show us how to do that.
Hey Nicole, good to see you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, so good to see you too. I miss you.
Oh shucks, I wish I was down there at Cascade Hollow with you. I do have a cocktail for you today. So we are going to be making a high dilution cocktail, like you mentioned, using George Dickel number 12, one of my favorite whiskeys. I love the sweetness and spice here. We're going to be making a Dickel 12 highball, and we're going to be using Dickel 12 as well as Hella dry bitters and soda. So Hella Cocktail Company did a great job of balancing all the different flavors here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we build this. Before we get started, we want to kind of go through and make sure you have everything at home to follow along with me. So really we're going to start off with a highball glass. Now the reason we're using a highball glass instead of a shorter glass is to balance that dilution, right? So we're controlling the ratio of our spirit, in this case George Dickel number 12, and our mixer, which is going to be the Hella bitters and soda. If we have too short a glass, the whiskey to mixer ratio is off. So we're going to use the highball glass for something that's a little bit longer. We call it a longer drink, a little bit more kind of easier to drink on a hot summer day. There's plenty of those down at Cascade Hollow. So we've got our jiggers to measure out our cocktail ingredients. We're not going to need our shakers today. We'll get into the mixing glass maybe later for another cocktail. But as of right now, your cocktail glass, your measuring device, we have our spirit and we have our mixer. Next thing is going to be ice. Ice is going to do two things for our cocktail. We're looking to balance both dilution and temperature. So one of the things about a highball glass is that it can hold a lot of ice, which is great because on a hot summer day, this is going to melt, and that extra dilution is going to be what keeps the drink together, right? So now we're going to add 2 parts George Dickel number 12. We've got the star of our show there, and Hella Cocktail Company bitters and soda. Now, just kind of give us an agitation, a little stir with our straw as we put this all together. Now, we're almost done. You can add a little bit more if you like. We want something that it balances both the flavors. For me, the big spice note here at Dickel 12 is going to go really comfortably with the gentian, and there's some sassafras in there on the bitters and soda side. The only thing we're going to do for a garnish, a little lemon wedge to make sure that we've got a little burst of acid. That kind of like something you smell as you're drinking. Delicious. And there you have George Dickel number 12 highball, featuring George Dickel number 12 and Hella Cocktail Company bitters and soda. Cheers.
That looks amazing and simple enough that even I could make it.
It is simple, but there's a lot of complex flavors here. And again, all that's coming from Dickel number 12, being that bold, spicy whiskey we love. I'm gonna get this cocktail bar flipped for our next drink and shoot it back to you in Cascade Hollow. Cheers, Nicole. Always a pleasure.
So what is a general manager and distiller? Great question. Pretty vague title, but ultimately it means that I have responsibility kind of across the whole entity of Cascade Hollow. So everything from how the whiskey is made and what goes on in the distillery, a lot of that is around quality. You know, obviously our team here is incredible experts at whiskey making, and they don't need me to tell them how to make a mash. But I spend a lot of time thinking about what other interesting things might we be able to make, what's our best way to make them, what kind of subtle tweaks could we make to make the whiskey maybe a little bit better, a little bit more consistent. And also I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the things that we need to not change to preserve the essential character of George Dickel. So that's a lot of what I do inside the distillery. Most of my time is spent either talking to people about the whiskey and how amazing it is, thinking about how we show up in the market, and my most fun, most favorite part of my job is really in the warehouses with the maturing whiskeys. So I spend a lot of time investigating our maturing whiskeys, how they're changing, how they are over time, and what unique things I might be able to blend out of them and express different character. Perfect. In the meantime, let's taste through the Dickle Rye. So Dickle Rye, it's really unique in our portfolio in that it's the only Dickel whiskey that's not distilled here at Cascade Hollow. But the way it makes its way into our portfolio is it utilizes the same chill charcoal mellowing that makes our Tennessee whiskeys so distinct. And what that does for the rye is traditionally a really spicy whiskey, right? And people mean kind of two different things when they say that. So the Christmas spice, kind of clove notes that are so distinct in some ryes, but also I think sometimes they just literally mean like spicy in your nose, spicy in your palate. And using that chill charcoal mellowing, it helps us kind of round that out. And so when you nose our rye, you know, you still get, the clove is what really presents itself to me first, but also a lot of that fruit character, kind of a tropical fruit note, and the grain, you know, that peppery character. So there's still a lot of complexity here, but when you sip on it, it's very smooth and kind of a lot more integrated than a typical rye whiskey flavor, which I think makes it really perfect for a spirit-forward traditional cocktail, which I think Brian's going to show us how to make.
Thank you. Welcome back. So today we're going to make one of my favorite whiskey cocktails of all time, and really a true classic, which is going to be a Manhattan. And so make sure you all can follow along with me. We'll walk you through kind of what I have set up here, and make sure you have something comparable at home. So we've got our ice bucket. I've already iced our mixing glass. Got our cherries for garnish. A coupe. We want to serve this cocktail up because it is spirit forward. We really want the whiskey to shine. There's not going to be a lot of dilution, so we're using a smaller glass. You can make a Manhattan on the rocks if you like, in which case use an old-fashioned glass. Something that, again, is going to not leave a lot of room for dilution. We've got our jiggers. There's a handful of different sizes. Find one that fits you and fits your hand. It's easier for you to work with so you can measure out all your ingredients. And that's going to be particularly important with this cocktail. Now a mixing glass, here I've got a Yari. You can use really anything you have, whether it's a pint glass, a shaker, but we're going to be stirring this drink because we want something that's rich. We don't need any aeration. If there's citrus, you should shake it. If there's no citrus, you should stir it. And a bar spoon. You can use a bar spoon if you have one. If you don't, a chopstick, butter knife, regular spoon, doesn't matter. You want the capability of moving the ice. We've got our aromatic bitters, dry vermouth, sweet vermouth, star of the show, George Dickle Rye. We'll get into why I love this whiskey in just a second. Our Hawthorne strainer, excuse me, our julep strainer to strain out the ice, and the shaker. Again, if you don't have a mixing glass, you can use the bottom of a shaker. We're not going to need it though. So that's the idea. And we're not just going to make any Manhattan. We're going to make a perfect Manhattan.
So Brian, what makes it a perfect Manhattan?
So that's a great question. A perfect Manhattan is perfect in that it balances both sweet and dry vermouth in equal proportions. Now these are made roughly the same way. Vermouth is an aromatized wine. So it's wine with botanicals, a little bit of spices, and it's fortified with brandy and left to kind of mature. In sweet vermouth, that's what you have. In dry vermouth, there's actually Florida yeast that lives inside the barrel and eats the sugars in that wine, making a much drier product. So it's not only a little drier in that it's less sweet, it also has a little bit more delicate flavors, a little bit nuttier, a little bit more citrus. And I find that the combination of those two vermouths really play well with the bold spice notes and herbaceous characteristics of Dickle Rye. So that's what we're going to use. Now, I've always considered Manhattans to be the perfect pre-drink cocktail, pre-dinner cocktail. The 2 parts of Dickle Rye as the star of our show, maybe 3/4 of a part sweet vermouth, and 3/4 of dry vermouth. Again, it's that perfect ratio. A dash or 2 of bitters. There's a lot of different bitters you can use. I think the more the better. But again, find the flavor profile that you like. Now, as we stir this, again, if there's no juice, stir it. If there's juice, shake it. We're just trying to get our temperature right and get a little bit of dilution so we have a really rich, bold, spirit-forward cocktail that's food-friendly. So we stir this down. Once we think we're about there, we take a little taste test for quality control. Add our strainer. Go ahead and pour this over our coupe glass. So this cocktail should be really spicy and herbaceous up front. Our garnish here, just a couple cherries on a pick. And there we have a George Dickle Rye Perfect Manhattan. Let's see if this is as good as it looks. And there we are. I hope this was easy to follow, and I hope you enjoy. Nicole, always a pleasure.
Perfect. So now I want to taste our George Dickel Bottled and Bond. So this is my baby. It's, you know, obviously one of my personal favorites. This was my idea kind of to make. This is the first whiskey that I made in my role as general manager and distillery here at Cascade Hollow. And the point I was trying to make with the Bottled and Bond, and the reason that I wanted to do it, was kind of twofold. So the number one thing I was really thinking about was celebrating the heritage of this place. You know, it's a 150-year-old brand, and I really wanted to show my respect for that, you know, kind of pay homage to the history of George Dickel. And there's no better way than reaching back to, you know, a category of whiskey that was created in 1897. But also I thought kind of the issues that created Bottled and Bond were just as relevant today. You know, the reason the Bottled and Bond Act was passed was about securing authenticity and transparency in whiskey. I don't think anyone's trying to put turpentine in a bottle and sell it as whiskey today, but you know, customers still care about that, or they still care about knowing the truth about where their whiskey came from and knowing that they're getting really good value for their money. And that's what Bottled and Bond is all about in American whiskey. And I was also, fully admit, kind of showing off at this place. You know, I really wanted to make the point that George Dickel has been quietly making amazing whiskey here, and it absolutely belongs in the pantheon of great American bourbon producers. So I fully admit, you know, when I was creating this whiskey for the first time back in 2019, I was really scouring our warehouses for the cream of the crop and the whiskeys that I thought would best make the point that George Dickel is an incredible American heritage bourbon producer. So for that first release, I selected the distilling season fall 2005, which is one of those unique little picadillos about Bottled and Bond. Besides the fact that it has to be at least 4 years old, has to be the product of one distillery, has to be bottled at 100 proof, and it cannot be adulterated with anything other than pure water. It also has to all be the product of one distilling season, which is one 6-month period in the year. So unlike Dickel 12, which is many, many layers of a wide range of ages, you have only one 6-month window to create Bottled and Bond. And I thought, in the spirit of disclosure, I would put that on the label and tell people which distilling season each Bottled and Bond whiskey came from. So that first one was from fall of 2005. And it really, I think, made the point, you know, that this is an incredible producer. It's a 13-year-old whiskey. It's the one that went on to win Whiskey of the Year, which was massively exciting, and I can't imagine a better way to make the point that I was trying to make. and talk about, no pressure for when I went in 2020 to create this one, which is the fall 2008 distilling season. And I selected this one partly because I thought it was very similar to the 2005 release, so it shared a lot of those kind of same tasting notes. If you notice it, it's very fruit and nut, right? But whereas the first one I think kind of presented more like dates and peanuts, what I get on this one is a lot of apple, pecan. It's a really rich and layered whiskey. And at 100 proof, I think it's still surprisingly sippable. It's a beautiful whiskey. I'm so proud of it. I think it really shows what we can do here at Cascade Hollow. And I'm so glad to be able to share it with you. I know I made more of it this year than last year, but it's still going pretty fast. So if you can find a bottle, it's one of my personal favorites. Thanks so much for joining us here at Cascade Hollow for this tasting. I really hope you enjoyed all of our whiskeys. I'm so honored to be able to share them with you.